Today the topic is how to tell your friends from the apes, and that's a serious question. It's even harder if you try to tell your Congress entities from the apes. You'll notice how carefully I avoided the human chauvinism of saying Congress persons. Well, yeah, there's a lot of human chauvinism going around these days. Hasn't been denounced nearly as much as it deserves. I was in the Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago recently. I saw the great horned owl. That's what it said on the cage, the great horned owl. I thought it was just a great horned owl, but they claimed it was the great horned owl. And the sign said, this bird should be considered a desirable species. So I read a little further, and it explained the great horned owl should be considered a desirable species because they eat all sorts of critters that farmers don't like. Now there's a dreadful example of human chauvinism for you. The great horned owl is desirable because it eats critters that farmers don't want hanging around. Now, I'm sure the great horned owl would consider itself a desirable species whether we thought so or not. And I'm sure the critters that it eats will never be persuaded that it's a desirable species. They undoubtedly regard the great horned owl as actively nefarious. And yet the zoo tells us we should regard it as desirable because it's doing something we like. It reminds me of the old Sufi riddle, why do crickets make that noise all night? The answer is to give philosophers something to argue about. Human chauvinism is so pervasive we hardly notice it, like fish hardly notice the water. J.B.S. Haldane, the great British biologist, was once asked if he admitted there was a mind behind evolution, something he was much inclined to doubt. But if he did admit a mind behind evolution, what would he, as a biologist, regard as its primary characteristic? He said immediately, an inordinate fondness for beetles. There are more beetles on this planet than anybody else. There are more beetles than there are people or ants or great horned owls or sharks or redwood trees. There are more beetles than all the other insects combined. There are more species of beetles than there are of all the other species of insects and all the species of mammals and amphibians and fish and flowers and plants put together. If there is a mind behind evolution, its main idea seems to be more beetles, more beetles. And yet, if there is a mind behind evolution, it also created the trapdoor spider, the first undercover agent in evolution. The trapdoor spider digs a little hole in the ground, puts leaves and twigs above it, so it looks like just part of the ground, and whenever a beetle goes by, the trapdoor spider jumps out and eats them. So the mind behind evolution not only likes lots and lots of beetles, it likes to have something devouring the beetles too. And so it gave the trapdoor spider enough smarts to disguise itself. Being a parent, a hazardous occupation at which I have some experience. Being a parent consists largely for the first year or so of running around saying, don't put that in your mouth. Babies want to taste everything. And you did that for the first year of your life. You were tasting everything you could get into your mouth that your parents couldn't stop you from getting into your mouth by getting there on time to say, don't put that in your mouth. That's because ontology, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. As a matter of fact, ontology recapitulates phylogeny too, now that I think of it. That's the first original idea I've had this week. Ontology recapitulates phylogeny. Our theories of being recapitulate evolution. I'll explain that in a minute now that I've thought of it. But anyway, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, and a baby is born with the most primitive circuitry in its brain already activated at birth. Life began with a simple oral biosurvival brain. Amoebas drift around tasting everything. And if it's nourishing, they ingest it. If it's not nourishing, they spit it out. Babies would probably do the same if we didn't interfere with them by yelling, don't put that in your mouth. Oral biosurvival intelligence is the most primordial type of intelligence. And as the dynamic gradients of simple protoplasm developed into the complex nervous systems of multicellular organisms and the still more complex nervous systems of amphibians and invertebrates and so on, the nervous system developed a genetic memory, apparently, that it knew what was good for it. And every mammal is born knowing the main place to go is, the first thing you do after you're born is find a tit. And if you can't find a tit, put anything else in your mouth you can find until you do find a tit. That's inbuilt knowledge. Babies aren't happy until they found a tit. If they can't find a tit, they'll settle for a bottle with a nipple on it. But it's, if they can't find that, they'll try anything else. This brings us already to Jungian archetypes. Jung talks about the archetype of the great mother. Well, an example of how powerful that archetype is and the way imprinting works. How many people here have ever heard of imprinting, just out of curiosity? Hey, what are you doing at a New Age convention? That's a 20th century idea, imprinting. Oh, you're slumming. Ah, that explains it. There was an orphanage in Greece where they got the idea of having the nurses try to act as substitute mothers, but they didn't want the children imprinting the nurses. I don't know if they used the word imprinting, but they knew that the children might develop bonds with the nurses, so they rotated it. Each nurse would spend a week acting as a mother to one child, and then she'd move on to another child. And they thought that way the children wouldn't form bonds with any of the nurses, which was hazardous, because if the children formed bonds with the nurses, they'd be in a terrible emotional wrench when the nurse quit her job, went to another hospital or another orphanage or whatnot, or if the children got adopted or got transferred to another orphanage or something. You can't have children forming emotional bonds with nurses, because that's an unstable relationship in time. And so they rotated the nurses. It turned out each child imprinted one nurse anyway. Apparently, the infant brain has an archetype of the great mother, and will try to imprint it on anything that comes along. And even if you rotate them, it'll pick one out and imprint that one, which gives you an idea how much we have in common with the European snow goose. Konrad Lorenz got the Nobel Prize in 1973 for his study of imprinting, and a lot of his work was done with the European snow goose. And he discovered that the European snow goose is born with this Jungian archetype. I don't think he ever used the word Jungian archetype, but it's what I'd call a Jungian archetype of mother goose. One of the goslings imprinted a ping pong ball because it saw a ping pong ball right after it was born, and the mother was not present for some reason, some accident in the experimental farm. And this gosling spent its whole infancy nestling with the ping pong ball. And when it grew up, it followed the ping pong ball everywhere. When it grew up, it tried to mate with the ping pong ball, which gives you an idea of how deep in genetics lies what Freud called the Oedipus complex. There's a similar story from Africa. Somebody observed a baby giraffe that had been whose mother had been shot by hunters. And the baby giraffe imprinted the hunter's jeep. And it followed the jeep around, tried to nurse from the jeep, which must have been a very frustrating experience. Although, considering the things babies put in their mouths, as I said, you realize how deep this desire to taste the universe is in the newborn of all mammalian species. When the giraffe grew up, it tried to mate with the jeep. Now, this gives you some concept of your Jungian archetypes. Jung said the archetype has no content. The archetype is just a vague general genetic potential. It has no specific content. Apparently, the gosling, wants to find a goose which is roundish and white. And if it can't find a goose, it will imprint something else that's roundish and white, like a ping pong ball. One of Lorenz's experimental birds imprinted him and followed him around all the time and tried to nest with him. That's apparently because he walked on two legs, like a goose does. Aristotle defined human beings as featherless bipeds because we have that thing in common with birds, two legs. Most mammals go around on all fours, as you know, if you've ever observed Congress. The giraffe imprinted the Jeep because it had 4 wheels, I assume, and the giraffe has 4 legs. 4 wheels are close enough to 4 legs to make an approximation of the archetype. We're all very vulnerable to imprinting right after we're born. If you have a cold and rejecting mother, you'll find somebody who's imprinted the universe as a cold and rejecting place, and they will eventually end up either in psychiatric treatment or in the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, where that reptilian, unemotional level is regarded as normal. In the first intelligence test in trying to differentiate your friends from the apes, or to find out how much you are differentiated from the apes, is to figure out what ping pong balls you've imprinted in your course of your life and why you're still compulsively attached to them. The strength of what can happen in points of imprint vulnerability is in what's known as the paradoxical reaction to terrorism. People who've been kidnapped by terrorists often imprint the terrorists. They come out saying, gee, they were really nice guys. Of course, they shot a couple of us and they were threatening to shoot me. But really, I began to realize what nice guys they were, basically. That's called the paradoxical reaction, because it doesn't make sense. If you haven't been kidnapped by terrorists, you can't understand why they're reacting that way. But the terrorists have one thing in common with the ideal mother. They feed you. While you're being held captive by them, they're the ones who are bringing in the food. And it seems that when you're in a situation of utter helplessness, like when you're being held by terrorists or the U.S. Army, or if you even get arrested by the cops, you're in that situation. When you're in a totally helpless position, all higher mental activity seems to cease, and you revert to the oral biosurvival circuit. And you look at who's going to feed me, and how can I please them so they'll go on feeding me and won't kill me. And so you begin imprinting onto the terrorists the great mother archetype, and eventually they become more and more likable guys. When you get a notice in the mail that says the President of the United States sends you greetings, report to your draft board on such and such a morning, you're hauled out of your natural environment. You know that if you run away, they'll pursue you, unless you get over the border to Canada very quickly. And then you can't come back unless you get some president who issues pardons. And there's all sorts of social pressure that tells you shouldn't run away, which is an interesting question. When people are threatening to kidnap and enslave you, why shouldn't you run away? It's the sensible thing to do. But we're subject to all sorts of weird imprinting, and most people imprint the government as a mother figure. The Statue of Liberty is a feminine symbol. Columbia is a feminine symbol. The mother country is a word that appears in most languages. Anyway, if you get kidnapped by the Army, you find yourself dragged out of your normal environment, held captive by people who have total control over you and who can shoot you for the, quote, crime of desertion. If you say, fuck this, I don't want to put up with this crap, I'm going home and back to my job, or back to goofing off or whatever I was doing, I'm not going to stand for this. You find out they got the right to shoot you, because that's called the crime of desertion. So you start imprinting them as mother figures. And that's the way you become a soldier. If you get put into a prison, you start imprinting the warden and the guards as substitute mother figures, because they feed you. They're responsible for your biosurvival as long as you're there. That'll get clearer as we go along. Let's move on to the second circuit. After you've spent a year crawling around, tasting everything, the DNA master tape, this is a great place to perch. I must learn to sit on the arms of couches more often. I'm getting as smart as my cat gradually. After about a year of crawling around on the biosurvival circuit, recapitulating the earliest stages of evolution, and undoubtedly babies at that stage think about the way the most primitive life forms think, the DNA master tape sends out RNA messenger molecules which run all over the body and signal the various organs, glands, the endocrine systems, and so on, up into the brain too. And you mutate to the next stage of evolution, which is the anal territorial circuit. All of the higher vertebrate species claim territory, and they usually mark it with excretions. Now, Freud noticed this stage of development. He said we start out with oral consciousness, and then with toilet training, we arrive at anal consciousness. Well, it's not the toilet training that does it. Apparently, it's an evolutionary script, because all animals, all of the higher, more complicated animals, claim territories and mark the territories with excretions. Now, in the human class of life, once you've been kidnapped into an army, your job is to defend the tribal territory, or at least that's what they tell you. Actually, your job is to expand the tribal territory. But they don't say, we're going to go over and grab that country and make it part of our territory. They say that country is threatening us and we got to go fight them, so they can't take over our territory. All governments and all wars use the same line. We're defending you against them. And Gurdjieff said we're all in a state of deep hypnosis. If anybody doubts that, if anybody thinks the human race at this stage of evolution is awake, in any realistic meaning of the word awake, just consider the fact that in every war, every government says we're defending ourselves against them, and nobody ever stops and thinks most of them must be lying. They can't all be fighting defensive wars. Some of them must be the aggressors. Why is it my gang are always the defensive ones? Why do I believe that? Have I been hypnotized or something? Or if you think you're rational, why is it the guys on the other side think they're fighting a defensive war? If they're in a state of deep hypnosis to believe that bullshit, isn't it possible you're in a state of deep hypnosis too? Ouspensky couldn't believe, when he was studying with Gurdjieff, he couldn't believe Gurdjieff's claim that people are in a state of deep hypnosis, sleepwalking all the time, until one day, shortly after the beginning of World War I, Ouspensky was walking through Moscow, and he saw a lorry, a truck. I lived in Ireland for 6 years, and I occasionally lapse back into Irish rather than American. They say lorry, we say truck. They say tomato, we say tomato. Let's call the whole thing off. Ouspensky saw a truck full of artificial legs, wooden legs in those days. Now we got better ones, prosthetic ones. It was heading for the front. And Ouspensky, who was a mathematician who had specialized in statistics, he realized that statistically the government could predict how many legs would be blown off, so they knew how many legs to send up to the front. And he suddenly realized this was only possible if people were mechanisms. Because if people were rational and had free will and free choice and thought for themselves, a lot of people would say, I'm not going up there and get my leg blown off. The reason you can predict how many legs are going to be blown off is because most people are in a deep enough state of hypnosis that they'll do whatever they're told, including going someplace to shoot at total strangers who are going to be shooting back at them for reasons they don't understand. Every border in the world, every national border, marks a place where two rival bands of domesticated primates fought until they were exhausted and then made a new territorial mark. Reptiles started the process. Every reptile has a pissing rock. Some species of reptiles, that's where the head reptile lives. Nobody else can piss on that rock. When you get to the mammals, you find they mark their territories by peeing on everything. If you take a dog for a walk, the dog pees every place it can. If you were to make a map of your neighborhood and mark the places where the dog pees, that marks the dog's territory. That's the way the dog claims its territory. Mammals all mark their territories with excretions. Domesticated primates, those who are passing as human but haven't quite achieved human brain functioning yet, mark their territories with ink excretions on paper, which are known as treaties at the end of the war. I know one half of my family came from Ireland. Where the other half of my family came from depends on what period you're talking about. When they left there, it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The city they came from was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but earlier in this century it was in Italy. Now I'm told it's in Yugoslavia. Have they been moving that city? The city is called Trieste. Have they been moving that city around? No, they've just been having fights and redrawing the territorial markers. This is ordinary primate behavior. If human beings consisted of nothing else but the oral biosurvival circuit and the anal territorial circuit, we couldn't distinguish friends from the apes at all. As a matter of fact, if you look at political behavior, it's kind of hard to see any distinction between human beings and apes at all. Everything seems to be governed by the oral survival circuit and the territorial anal circuit. And people who study politics most profoundly are the most pessimistic people on the planet. John Stuart Mill said, "I entered Parliament with what I thought was the lowest possible opinion of the average member. When I left Parliament, that opinion was even lower." The English anarchists have a slogan every election day: "Vote for Guy Fawkes, the only one who ever entered Parliament with honest intentions." He was the one who tried to blow up Parliament. Around 4 million years ago, the Australopithecines in South Africa began making tools. This is the first time in history that had ever occurred. Chimpanzees occasionally use sticks to knock things down or to reach for things. The Australopithecines started making tools out of stone and carving them to get the right shape. This involves a feedback loop between the left brain and the right hand. Mammals don't have right-left preferences like human beings. Some of the higher primates show a slight tendency to right-handedness part of the time, but it's not consistent. Human beings, we find 90% are right-handed and 10% for some reason are left-handed. This is undoubtedly the result of original sin or something. Well, I don't know. Anthropologically, if you study comparative societies, you find in every society 10% are left-handed and 10% are homosexual. Now, according to Jerry Falwell, the homosexuals have chosen to be that way just because they're pissed off at him and Jesus and want to get him and Jesus irritated. My guess is that left-handedness and homosexuality are genetic programs. I think we are programmed genetically so that a certain percentage of the population, around 10% everywhere in the world, will be left-handed because left-handed people use the right brain more than right-handed people do, and we need 10% of the population at any stage in evolution. We need 10% who are rather right brain just to give us a little proportion, and I assume we need 10% who are homosexual to give us a different perspective on things. The main quality of homosexuality that makes it an evolutionary survival asset is they don't reproduce. The type 6 homosexuals, according to Kinsey's criteria, type 6, the type who never have heterosexual relations at all, they don't reproduce. What does that mean? That means they're not dragged down by children. That means they have more time to philosophize and play head games and create weird art forms and weird ideas and weird cultures which mutate the whole society. A celibacy was probably developed by the Catholic Church as a substitute for homosexuality because they didn't want to have an overtly homosexual church, and so they created a covertly homosexual church by saying, oh, they're all living in celibacy in there. There was an article in a Catholic magazine recently admitting there's a vast gay subculture in all the seminaries in the United States. That's the first time any Catholic publication admitted it. But the function of celibacy and homosexuality ought to get some people out of the breeding population so that they can think weird thoughts and are not continually concerned with the things that the breeding population are concerned with, namely how to get enough money to support their children. Once you've had children, you have this guilty sense, I can't let them starve. And so your vision tends to get narrowed down to the tunnel vision of how do I get enough money to feed this many people for at least a couple of months ahead, and then after that, how do I get more money to feed them for a few more months ahead? Can I get enough to guarantee that I can put them through college, and so on? That is the necessary quality of the normal heterosexual pattern of the majority throughout history. Which is why there used to be the word gay and straight. Straight implies square, and square implies being utterly preoccupied with these survival issues and not having time to philosophize about the universe in general. Anyway, the Australopithecines made tools. The Neanderthals made even more complicated tools and buried their dead with their heads facing east, which indicates that all this left brain activity was producing abstract ideas. Mammals, as far as I know, don't bury their dead. If they did, I suppose they'd bury them in random patterns. Burying all of the dead facing east suggests that the Neanderthals must have had some metaphysical doctrine relating to the east and the rising sun. And since the earliest religions we know anything about all have doctrines of resurrection or reincarnation in them, and all worship the rising sun, the earliest Egyptian religion was based on worship of Horus, the lord of two horizons, the rising sun and the setting sun, and was connected with the belief in reincarnation. Ideas like that were probably being invented in Neanderthal days, and that's why they buried the dead with their heads facing the rising sun. The rising sun has always been a symbol of resurrection and new life. The semantic circuit is also a time-binding circuit. Once we've got language, and especially once we've got written language, whether it's going to be Egyptian hieroglyphics, Chinese ideograms, or the alphabet in its Jewish, Arabic, or European forms, any type of written language means that signals can travel through time in a way that is just not possible on the mammalian level. This is where we begin to be able to distinguish our friends from the apes. Theoretically, potentially, even George Bush can receive signals from Socrates. Now, if there was 2,500 years ago a rat who was the rat equivalent of Socrates, a rat of incredible wisdom, one who just didn't go around like the other rats bitching about the wise guys who stuff rat holes with Brillo, but said, let's do something about it. Let's build tools and pull the Brillo out of the rat holes or something like that. And if there was a super rat 2,500 years ago, the rats of today don't know anything about it because they do not have language that transmits ideas across time. I can get signals from Socrates. I can get signals from Confucius. If I have the patience, I can get signals from Confucius in Chinese. All I got to do is spend about 15 years mastering the Chinese language and its intricacies and nuances. If I don't want to spend that much time, I get diluted messages from Confucius by way of English translations. Important units in science are always named after important individuals, like the ohm is named after Ohm, the volt is named after Volta, the farad is named after Faraday, and so on. So I decided to name that after the celebrated Hebrew philosopher who was allegedly born that year, or 4 BC, or sometime around then, Yeshua ben Yosef, whom the Goyim call Jesus Christ. If you turn your television to the channels in the high 40s, you'll find that Jesus Christ needs money. He's real desperate for money, and there's a whole bunch of people on there collecting for him. So I don't know what he needs so much money for when he's been dead 2,000 years, but maybe life on the other plane is just as desperate as it is here. You know? So by 1 AD, all the knowledge from the time the Australopithecines made the first stone implements, all the knowledge that began with the Bronze Age, when somebody in Cambodia discovered if you leave tin and copper in the same fire, you get something out that's neither tin nor copper, bronze, which is much stronger than tin or copper. All the knowledge, they knew 9 chemical elements in Asia before the birth of Christ. We had all of Greek philosophy. Thales proved everything was made out of water, and then Democritus proved everything was made out of atoms, and then Heraclitus proved everything was made out of fire, and then Gorgias proved you couldn't prove anything, and Aristotle invented codified Greek logic and convinced the whole Western world for nearly 2,000 years that that was the only possible form of logic. We didn't learn better until Oriental studies brought us the news that Buddhist logic has 4 values instead of 2, and quantum mechanics developed 3-valued logics. And all of that knowledge up until 1 AD is 1 Jesus on this scale. And how long did it take to double? It took until 1500. In 1500, 8 years after Columbus sailed, And Leonardo da Vinci was 48 years old. In 1500, we had two Jesus. We had two bits of information for every bit of information we had in 1 AD. Within 17 years, Martin Luther hung his 92 theses on the church. No, 92 theses, I'm sorry. Hey, it would have been more colorful if he hung 92 theses on the church door, wouldn't it? That would be a real surrealist act. Well, the world wasn't ready for surrealism yet. Protestantism was radical enough. That was the first successful Protestant revolution, 17 years after knowledge doubled. Information has consequences. One breeding generation, 17 years is a breeding generation, more or less, especially in those days when most people got married in their teens. 17 years later, in 1534, Henry VIII started the second successful Protestant revolution. Europe was plunged into religious wars for 200 years until, for the rational individuals, religion and insanity became virtually synonymous terms. Religion in those days took the form that it still takes in the Mideast, where, I mean, the religious fanatics in America are relatively civilized. I know that's hard to believe if you run into them. Like, there's a bunch of them hanging around downstairs warning everybody as they come in, this is the work of the devil. But those people just want to burn books. Do you realize how civilized that is, to just burn books? I'm against it. I'm one of the leading opponents of censorship in all forms. But it's so civilized to just burn the books. 300 years ago, they were burning the people who wrote the books. And the Ayatollah Khomeini is still at that level of civilization. The Ayatollah found a book he didn't like, so he put out a contract on the guy who wrote it. Was it 1.6 million? Now it's 5 million to shoot the guy who wrote that book. Well, that's the way the Catholic Church used to behave. In 1600, they found a book by Giordano Bruno they didn't like, so they burned him alive in Rome. Bruno said to the inquisitors, "You have more to fear this day than I have." And indeed, the Catholic Church has been falling apart ever since, although they hate to admit it, but they do not control the whole Western world, which they once did and which they would like to do again. By 1750, knowledge had doubled again, and we had 4 Jesus. It only took 250 years. In 1765, James Watt looked at the steam kettle on his mother's oven and noticed the top jumping up and down and thought the steam was creating pressure. He had 4 bits of information for every bit of information the most educated Roman had in 1 AD. And he was able to put ideas together in new ways. The more bits of information you have, the more new ideas you can get. And he thought, hey, if we built things to deliberately control the production of steam, we could move things and have pistons and wheels and whatnot. And he invented the steam engine, and the Industrial Revolution began to happen, with the usual cultural dislocations and discombobulations that happen in every major quantum jump. In 1776, we had the American Declaration of Independence, in which it was declared for the first time that all males are created equal. That was a very revolutionary idea for its time. Tom Paine wrote a book of his own saying that females were created equal to males too, but that was too radical to get into the Declaration of Independence. A few years after the Declaration of Independence, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women, the first major feminist work since the Bronze Age had begun the subjugation of women. In 1789, we had the French Revolution, 1798, the United Irish Rebellion, 1810, the first Mexican Revolution, around then all the Bolivar revolutions in Latin America. By the time the Industrial Revolution was over, the divine monarchs, the sun kings of the Bronze Age, were pretty much on the run. Very few of them have survived. They still have kings in England, kings or queens in England, Denmark, and a few other places, but they survive only on condition that they don't meddle in politics. The king used to be as absolute as the Ayatollah or the Pope. Now the kings are just figureheads. Democracy is swept across large parts of the world. The Constitution of North Vietnam begins with the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all humans are created equal." You can see the influence of Thomas Jefferson in the attempt to update Thomas Jefferson also. Where industrialism happens, democracy feminism, libertarianism, socialism, anarchism, and a lot of other radical ideas always follow in its wake. And so does a declining birth rate, which is a mysterious thing I don't quite understand. But as soon as a country industrializes, the women decide they're going to have less children. Which is why we are not up to standing on one another's shoulders the way it was predicted in the 1950s we would be by the 1980s. Population does not continue to grow indefinitely. It only continues to grow in the transition from agricultural to industrial economy. Then it levels off. Where was I? 1750. By 1900, knowledge had doubled again, and we had 8 Jesus. By 1950, it had doubled again, and we had 16 Jesus. By then, the computer revolution was beginning. John von Neumann had designed the first programmable computer in 48. By 1960, knowledge had doubled again, and we had 32J. By 1967, knowledge had doubled again, and we had 64J. By 1973, knowledge had doubled again, and we had 128J. At which point Andela completed his study, and I haven't seen anything more recent than that. But all the signs, the number of patents granted per year, the number of mathematical papers published every year, the number of new products on the market, everything indicates that information is increasing at an even more rapid rate. Engineers measure machines in revolutions per second. If you measure the doubling of information in the old Stone Age, you found that it was going in revolutions per millennium. Then it gradually revved up to going revolutions per century. Now it's going then it was going revolutions per generation. Now revolutions per decade, and it looks like we're moving up to the point where it'll be going in revolutions per year. And that is the way the third circuit of the nervous system, the semantic circuit, operates. It's a time-binding circuit. Information accumulates in time. The first sun kings of the first Bronze Age slave agricultural societies discovered that it was possible to train domesticated primates to feel ashamed of themselves. It is also possible to do that to dogs, as you may have noticed. You can make a dog feel shame. You can't do that with a cat. Has anybody ever succeeded in making a cat feel guilty? It depends on the sociability of the animal. The more sociable the animal, the more guilt that can be induced. Social animals want to be approved of, evidently. You can make dogs feel very guilty. You can make human beings feel much guiltier. You can never make a cat feel guilty about anything. You can get 6 dogs to pull a sled. You can't get 6 cats to pull a sled. You can't get 6 cats to do anything together. No way has ever been found to outstubborn a cat. I said to my wife once, you know, cats aren't as smart as dogs. And she said, they're as smart as they have to be, which is probably the last word on cats. Well, no, she also said once, you know, if cats had exactly the same personality but looked like iguanas, we wouldn't have them in our laps. We'd be driving them out of the house with sticks. Beauty is the great seducer. Cats are so beautiful, we tolerate their antisocial attitudes. With the domestication of most of the population, that is, with the establishment of slavery and serfdom, slavery first, serfdom was a slight modification of slavery, the divine king proclaimed, and the priests went forth and seconded the motion, that being descended from the sun, the Inca was descended from the sun, the Mikado was descended from the sun. These divine kings are generally descended from the sun. As late as the 18th century, Louis XIV was still called the Sun King. They proclaimed that they were descended from the sun god, and therefore they were divine, and therefore anybody who disobeyed them was committing sin, which not only meant that you were going to be punished if the soldiers or the police caught you, but that you were in violation of God's ordinances, and God was known to have a terrible temper in those early days. The primitive idea of God is preserved in the Old Testament, which is why people who read the Old Testament a lot generally act very primitive. The God of the Old Testament is a grouchy old man with a paranoid obsession with who's jacking off down the street and who's bawling who, and questions that never concern a civilized mind. I have never once wondered what's going on in the house next door. I mean, what are they doing in their bedroom? It's no business of mine. The God of the Old Testament has a paranoid obsession with questions like that, and he wants all of his followers to have the same paranoia. He's always threatening people. He blows up cities. Mark Twain tells a story about a guy who got converted by a clergyman and said, "What do I do now that I'm converted?" And the clergyman says, "Imitate God." And about 2 weeks later, the guy was arrested for destroying several cities and striking his son blind and so on. The clergyman said, "Only imitate God when he's in his better mood." Through the Old Testament, he's usually in his bad mood. But all the early gods were like that. They were probably projections of the Sun King, the personality of the Sun King. And as Lord Acton said, all power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Caligula is sort of the epiphany, the synecdoche, he is the summary of what these ancient sun kingdoms were like. Caligula apparently was motivated not just by the desire to have fun in a lot of mean and sadistic ways, but also to see how much he could get away with before the Senate would finally decide to throw him out and restore the Republic or do something equally revolutionary. He not only did all sorts of abominable acts recorded by Suetonius and dramatized by Robert Graves. Caligula appointed his horse to the Senate just to insult the senators. When they decided they'd put up with that crap too, he announced that his horse was a god and they had to worship the horse. After all, he was a god already, so why couldn't his horse be a god? In The Mass Psychology of Fascism, Wilhelm Reich says Hitler didn't invent anything. The whole fascist philosophy comes out of the last couple of thousand years of Bronze Age history, the ancient sun kingdoms. The Führer is just a god on earth, like all these ancient kings were supposed to be. But we've all been domesticated by them. There's not any segment of the human race which hasn't endured the experience of conquest and slavery. And so we've all got what Nietzsche calls slave attitudes. And that makes up the fourth circuit of the brain. The fourth circuit is the circuit that's continually looking at the lower three circuits and saying, is this okay? Am I allowed to think this? Am I allowed to feel this? Am I allowed to enjoy this? Will the king come and cut off my wang if he finds out I've been thinking these kind of thoughts? That's the guilt circuit. And the guilt circuit has so much power over people that literally the average young male will go someplace to shoot at strangers who are shooting at him rather than run away just out of fear of a word. The word is cowardice. That word will control people to the extent that they'll have their legs and arms blown off, or they'll lose their eyesight, or they'll come back as basket cases without arms and legs, or they'll die. Just the fear of that word and the idea that the king, or the modern representative of the king, the president, knows what's right and one must obey. One does not dare think for oneself or act on what one thinks. And so by the time we got to the forebrain stage, we were obviously quite a bit different than the apes, and yet we were still being controlled by very mechanical processes. The conditioning and imprinting of the biosurvival circuit determines how much aggression or timidity we have. If the biosurvival circuit is nurtured by a warm and permissive mother, we tend to explore the universe, try new things. People with permissive mothers try exotic foods. People who had very restrictive mothers are afraid to eat anything that wasn't the food of their childhood. You go to an exotic restaurant, a Thai restaurant, or something even more exotic, Pakistani restaurant. That's still exotic. That's new enough to be exotic. The people there all had very permissive mothers. Otherwise, they'd be eating cheeseburgers at McDonald's, because that's what they grew up with. Adorno's book, The Authoritarian Personality, documents this statistically. Food preferences are related to basic conservatism or creativity. The more timidity on the biosurvival circuit, the more conservatism on the third circuit, the idea circuit. People who are afraid of exotic foods are afraid of exotic ideas. The second circuit is very mechanical. You learn your position in the hierarchy. Within 24 hours after a litter of puppies is born, if you ever had dogs, you've observed this, it's clearly established who's the top dog and who's the bottom dog and who's in the middle. The same thing goes on in every community. People imprint a powerful role or a submissive role. The third circuit gets imprinted with the local reality tunnel. And this is so mechanical that if you know somebody was raised in Dublin, Ireland, you know they're going to have a lot of Catholic attitudes, even if they call themselves atheists. If you know they grew up in Moscow, you know they're going to have a lot of Marxist attitudes, even if they're in rebellion against Marxism and fled from Russia. If you knew they grew up in Ohio in a Methodist family, you know they're going to have Ohio Methodist attitudes to a great extent. The local tribal reality tunnel tends to be very hypnotic. About the only way you can cure it is by traveling a lot. If you keep going into different reality tunnels, if you go from Los Angeles to Dublin and live in Dublin a few years, and then go live in Mexico City for a while, then go live in Berlin, then go live in the southern France, you might get a little more flexible. Otherwise, you tend to stereotypically repeat the reality tunnel of your parents and your school teachers when you were very young. And the socio-sexual guilt circuit is very mechanical too. Like when I was reaching puberty in Brooklyn in the 1940s, Bush meant pubic hair and Quayle meant vagina. And at the cusp of puberty, when I was 12 years old, 12 to 13, the major topic of conversation in the boys' room was how the hell can you get into the bush and get into the quail? And do you know a girl who let you touch her there? Yeah, I rubbed her bush. I know a girl who let me get her fingers into her quail. And this is the major topic of conversation when you're 13 years old. I don't know if the women are aware of this, but this is what the boys are talking about when they're 12 or 13. Bush and quail, bush and quail. And this has imprinted me so heavily that I'm terribly embarrassed about who's in the White House. Every time I see a headline about Bush and Quayle, I think, how can they print that? That should be in Screw magazine. How can they print it in ordinary newspapers? See, that's the power of the early imprint. I can't think of Bush and Quayle without blushing. I haven't blushed in 30 years, but they're throwing me back into the dawn of adolescence. I wish they changed their names. It has been estimated that to duplicate the human brain with state-of-the-art technology would require a computer as tall as the World Trade Center and as big around as the state of Texas. And yet we all possess a computer of that power right inside our skulls here. It's got over 10 billion cells which are capable of a number of connections so high that it's the highest number ever to enter scientific literature. It's higher than the number of atoms in the known universe. And yet we got this brain. This is one of God's worst mistakes. I'm writing a book on God's 17 worst mistakes. And one of the worst mistakes was giving us this incredible brain and neglecting to give us an operating manual. Now, if you ever got a hard disk with say 17 megabytes of software on it and no manual, you find yourself going crazy trying to figure out how to use all this great computational power and always doing the wrong thing. And that has been the history of humanity to date. We've got this fantastic biocomputer and we don't have an operating manual. And so we get imprinted with basic timidity or aggression on the biosurvival circuit, and we robotically follow that pattern all our lives. People who are timid in grade school are timid in high school, and they're still timid in their 50s or 60s. People who are aggressive remain aggressive all their lives and a royal pain in the ass to everybody else, no matter how old they get. People who are confident of their space and territory remain confident. People who are not confident of their space and territory are neurotically submissive or neurotically rebellious and fighting everybody whether they have to or not. And people tend to remain stuck in the reality tunnel of their local tribe, as I was pointing out. And the first orgasm is a moment of high imprint vulnerability, to say the least of it. Masters and Johnson, in their book, Human Sexual Dysfunction, they quote a case of a guy who came to them who had his first sexual experience, if you can call it that, or his first sexual disaster, was in the back seat of a car I think that's true of a lot of Americans of this generation, but usually it's not as disastrous as in his case. He was just about to make out, whatever is the current terminology, when suddenly a policeman appeared at the window of the car with a flashlight, yellowing, "What are you kids doing in there?" Now remember, we got 6,000 years of training by the Sun Kings and their enforcers about we got to obey the authorities and we can't have any fun because all forms of fun are sinful. We've been brainwashed for the last 300 years by Puritanism, which Mencken defined as the haunting fear that somebody somewhere might be having a good time. And we've all been conditioned about cops. You know, I figured out recently that in the average week you can see between 20 and 40 shows about cops on television. Maybe it's more than 40. I was just making a rough estimate, but between 20 and 40 in the average week. Now, that kind of programming, we tend to think the cops are the most important part of the world because we see more of them on television than anybody else. Imagine if there were 20 to 40 shows about landlords every week. The television viewers, the couch potatoes, their whole reality tunnel would be twisted around. It would be closer to reality because most of us are dealing with landlords all the time and we hardly ever have to deal with the police. And yet we see all these shows about cops and those shows about landlords. I've only had altercations with the police twice in my life. Well, I mean altercations involving identification and so on. I've been tear gassed a number of times and chased by the police for walking on the street in a group of more than 5. This was during the 60s when I thought it was the smart thing to do to go out and march in protest demonstrations. I later decided there were more effective ways of changing the system, but only a couple of days ago I had another altercation with a policeman. I was crossing a street in the wrong place, and he gave me a very complicated piece of paper which tells me I'll get a courtesy notice in the mail telling me what my fine is. But if I don't get the courtesy notice, it's my duty to notify them they forgot to send me the courtesy notice, because if I don't notify them, I'm in contempt of court. So apparently this means if we fuck up, it's your fault. So you got to be on the ball and make sure we don't fuck up because we don't take responsibility for anything. And it didn't tell me how many days I should wait before I notify them that they haven't sent me their courtesy notice yet. It's telling me how much they're going to take of my money for crossing the street in the wrong place. But I'm dealing with landlords all the time, every day of my whole life. My parents have been dealing with landlords. I've been dealing with landlords. Anyway, a cop is a power figure in our society. It doesn't need television. They were power figures even before television. They're armed and dangerous. Everybody knows that. And so this guy was making out in the back seat of a car, and this cop appears with a flashlight and bellows, "What are you kids doing?" Now, what do you think that guy imprinted as his sexual pattern?
Flashlight.
No, he imprinted impotence. When he arrived at the Masters Johnson Clinic 20 years later, he had been impotent for 20 years, ever since that experience. Now, does that remind you of the Gosling who imprinted the ping pong ball, the people who imprint terrorists? At moments of high emotional intensity, we all become subject to imprint vulnerability. And that's why people do dangerous things over and over, some people. Some people keep climbing mountains, even though you know if you climb enough mountains, the chance of an accident gets higher and higher all the time. But they get such a charge out of the stress and the danger and the excitement that they keep going back. Some people keep racing in professional auto racing, like the Grand Prix or the Indianapolis 500, even though a certain number of them crack up every year. Hemingway kept going back to Africa to shoot at lions. High involvement, high intensity keys off a lot of neurochemicals which make you feel really on top of the world. And if you find out you can get them by danger, you keep going back to danger. If you find out you can get those high involved feelings by smoking pot, you tend to go on smoking pot up until you run into a policeman with a flashlight who says, "What are you doing in there?" and hauls your ass off to court. If you find out you can get it by mantra, you'll keep on doing mantra for the rest of your life. Then once again, we see the power of imprint vulnerability. High involvement, relaxed alertness, the the state in which you have no anxiety. Hemingway describes it very well in his short story, A Soldier's Home, where Krebs finds he can't adjust to civilian life. And everybody thinks, well, he saw such horrors in the war that he's just emotionally damaged. But the real problem with Krebs is that he finds civilian life so damn boring. Because in war, there were those moments where, as Krebs thinks, you didn't have time to think, and you did the right thing, and you knew it was the right thing, and you came out alive, and that proved it was the right thing. And until you find moments like that, life does seem flat and dull. Those are moments of what Leary calls the Fifth Circuit. This whole system of circuitry I've been using today is borrowed from Timothy Leary, by the way. I've developed it in my own peculiar ways, but it's basically Leary's. Although if you trace it back far enough, you'll find it's very similar to the Gurdjieff system also, which comes out of traditional Sufism. I just thought I'd throw that in so nobody thinks I'm an original thinker. On the Fifth Circuit, the neurosomatic circuit, we have a rush of neurochemicals that run all over the body and run all over the brain, opening new circuits and new patterns. The neuropeptides are the ones that have been identified so far. Neuropeptides act like hormones when they're in the body, and they act like neurotransmitters when they're in the brain. This gives them a dual nature, like the thingamajigs in quantum theory, which are particles part of the time and waves part of the time. The neurotransmitters are hormones part of the time, the neuropeptides are hormones part of the time, and neurotransmitters part of the time. When you're on the neurosomatic circuit, you do the right thing and you know it's the right thing, and there is no anxiety, there is no uncertainty, and the universe is a very beautiful place. And anybody who finds access to the neurosomatic circuit, as I said, keeps repeating their favorite technique of getting back there. And that tends to become as mechanical as the first four circuits. Unless there's some dawning of the Sixth Circuit, which is the meta-programming circuit, the tendency is that some people mechanically imprint one neurosomatic technique, those who found one. Most people remain on the Fourth Circuit level most of their lives, which is why it is such a hard problem to tell your friends from the apes. As I said, most of these circuits are duplicated in the other mammals. Those who do find access to the Fifth Circuit tend to mechanically repeat the technique that gets them there, whether it's smoking pot or doing mantra or going to Africa to shoot at great big pussy cats, like Mr. Hemingway. Others become more philosophical. The Fifth Circuit is a very philosophical place because you're very laid back when you're on the Fifth Circuit, and you start thinking philosophically. I wonder how many ways there are to get here, because if your favorite technique is pot, you find out that you can't smoke pot in the office. The boss will come around and throw a fit if he catches you. Nowadays, they're doing urine tests to make sure you're not smoking pot in the office or before you come to the office. I lived in Europe for 6 years. It was quite a shock to come back here and find the government is prying into the bladders of the citizens, and they've still got the Statue of Liberty standing in New York Harbor with the torch up there and all, the land of the free, the home of the brave, and hand in your urine so we can find out what you're doing in your own private time. George Bush voluntarily submitted to a urine test to set a good example in totalitarianism when he was vice president. Then he refused a lie detector test in the Iran-Contra investigation, which I think indicates that George doesn't want us to know whether he's telling the truth or lying, but he wants us to know he's not stoned while he's doing it. The most interesting thing about urine tests is they register alcohol, marijuana, and cocaine among the three of the most popular drugs in the country, but they don't register LSD. Now, I don't know how long this idiocy is going to go on. The Holy Inquisition went on for 800 years. Nazi Germany only lasted 13 years. I don't know how long this idiocy is going on, but I started to think, supposing urine testing really survives, what will be the evolutionary effect of this? Well, they'll weed out the people who like booze and the potheads and the coke freaks. And who will move up in the hierarchy? The people who use a drug which doesn't get registered on urine, that's LSD. So if this goes on in 20 years, the corporate hierarchy of America will be infested with acid heads, while all the potheads and coke freaks are out on the street begging along with the other homeless. Well, that's just a guess. But they're not going to find a urine test that detects LSD because that stuff is so small and so subtle that it's not likely to be discovered by any of those methods. Did you have a question?
What about psilocybin?
Psilocybin also doesn't register on those tests. With the psychedelic people, I'm sorry, the potheads seem to be going to be pushed off to the... Unless the country suddenly returns to the Bill of Rights and we suddenly have the right to the privacy of our own bladder again. Yes?
Can a person move beyond the Fifth Circuit into the Sixth Circuit or Seventh with the use of marijuana?
Pot gives you occasional vistas of the Sixth and Seventh Circuits. Can you get to the Sixth and Seventh Circuits in a permanent way with marijuana? I'm not sure. The trouble is, this is the most interesting age of neuroscience ever. There have been more important discoveries in the neurological sciences, the sciences related to neurology, neurobiology, neurochemistry, and so on in the last 20 years than in all previous history. But it's all coming so fast that everybody's generalizations have to be a little bit tentative. Like, I can try to judge my own mental state, although that's a hazardous thing to try to do, since there's so much self-deception in all of us. But if I try to guess how I got to this mental state, I don't know how much to attribute to marijuana and how much to attribute to brain machines like the David or the MC squared, how much to attribute to Buddhist meditation, how much to attribute to the genes I inherited. It's hard to say what...
Like Crowley would use, what, tantric sex and marijuana, and this would serve as an elevation to permanently, or am I wrong?
Yeah, Crowley seems to have been an adept of Tantra to the extreme extent. If one believes his writings, which I tend to, he seems to have found it very easy to get up to the Eighth Circuit, just using grass and sex. That's such an old Hindu secret. The Bengali Hindus have been practicing ritual sex with marijuana for about 3,000 years at least as a path of access to the higher circuits of the brain. If you start investigating, you find there are all sorts of techniques that will get you to the Fifth Circuit or higher. I'd like to try a little experiment here, since this is called a workshop. I might as well do some work. When I say go, I would like everybody to close your eyes and listen intently to every sound you hear, and try not to put labels on the sounds. If you hear somebody cough, make the effort not to think that's a cough, but just to go with the sound. Now, most people can't do this, but at a Whole Life Expo, you've all had enough experience with meditation that you can do it fairly well. Let's just see what happens if you really concentrate on the sounds and try to keep words out of your head. Is that clear?
That is clear.
Okay. Go. Close your eyes. Go. How many felt that you were getting high? How many felt a kind of euphoria or tranquility? How many felt an increased alertness along with the euphoria? There, you see, this is an old Sufi exercise, which I learned from an old Sufi, and you can do this. You can do this in the office if you have an office job, and you won't get busted for it. You still have the privacy of your own brain. It doesn't show up on urine tests. And this is the metaprogramming circuit that I'm talking about. That's a Fifth Circuit experiment. I was turning you on to the Fifth Circuit briefly, but it's a metaprogramming exercise because you're learning to control your own brain. You're beginning to develop an operating manual for the human brain. Now, theoretically, the human brain being the most efficient computer we know of at this stage of evolution, We don't know how many more efficient brains they may be elsewhere in the universe, but the human brain is the most powerful one we know of around these parts. The human brain should be used for fun and profit. And yet most people use their brains for misery and masochism. That's due to the 6,000 years of brainwashing by patriarchal Sun King slave-based agricultural civilizations and the carryover of that into the industrial and democratic age, even into the socialist countries. Some of the Marxist countries are the most reactionary. We've still got this Bronze Age conditioning and imprinting to undo in ourselves. And so we all have tendencies towards masochism, pessimism, and self-defeat and so on because of all of that. And yet we are learning through modern neuroscience and by studying Oriental neuroscience and combining the two, we are learning how to program our own brains. So the major question at this stage of earthly history and evolution is, are you going to go on being programmed by old masochistic, defeatist, loser scripts, or are you going to learn to control your own brain, use it for fun and profit, and be guided always by a winner script? Now, it seems the commonsensical thing to choose a winner script, but you'll find a lot of resistance in yourself. Most people do. You find a lot of resistance because loser scripts get rewarded in our society. If you define yourself as an alcoholic, all your friends will forgive you for your abominable behavior. Oh, he can't help it, he's an alcoholic. If you can prove there's something else seriously wrong with you, oh, well, we got to be tolerant of that. That's what our Eric Brain calls the wooden leg game. How can you expect a man with a wooden leg to resist embezzling funds from the company? How can you expect a man with a wooden leg to keep his temper when the kids are noisy? Let me batter them around some more. We've all got excuses, but if you want to use the human brain for fun and profit, you got to learn to give up your excuses and take responsibility for using your brain intelligently, learning more and more about the various techniques of higher consciousness and higher intelligence, which I can't teach you here in 1 2-hour workshop. I'm just giving you some theory and some examples of where you can learn more. I got a book called Prometheus Rising, which gives you about 100 exercises which are as good for your brain as 100 yoga exercises would be for your body. And if you get that book and do the exercises, that's a very important point. A lot of people buy the book, read it, and say, wow, I sure learned a lot, and they never do the exercises. They haven't learned anything. They've just learned some new verbalizations. If you want to learn how to use your brain for fun and profit, you got to do the exercises. And don't think you can get everything out of that book. I only have 100 or so exercises. There are lots of other exercises you can learn other places. Go to Esalen, learn all the latest techniques. Why be satisfied with the brain that was created by accidental imprinting and conditioning? Build yourself the best brain you can have. Always try to find new techniques. I've been very excited the last 2 years by the brain machines that adjust your brain rhythms to whatever frequency you want to go to. Machines like the Pulsar, the MC Squared, the NeuroPep, and so on. I find it fascinating to sit there and turn the dial to 7.5 hertz and find myself going into alpha and think, gee, I can do it anytime I want. This is very useful when I'm on a lecture tour and I'm going through 20 cities in a month, and I get pretty stressed out at times, and I look at my watch. I've been socializing with the people who've invited me there. I've been trying to be friendly and open and all that, and I'm really tired. And then I realize I got to go on in an hour and a half, and I just can't sit down and meditate. You don't get... And I say, pardon me, and I got to relax for a while. I go up to my room, I turn on a brain machine, and I go into alpha, and I appear on the stage, and everybody says, my God, you look younger than last year. There are new types of these machines coming out all the time. The grain potentializer is a table that revolves in an electromagnetic field. Really fascinating what it does. There's a firm in North Carolina that makes what they call psychoacoustic tapes. And these work entirely on sound, but this company has learned a hell of a lot about sound. Those tapes do as much as the most advanced brain machines I've seen. Once you've learned some of the basic techniques of metaprogramming, you will eventually find your ways through the deepened quality of right brain, left brain integration and the ability to go into alpha and theta states more and more frequently, that you start having what the New Age calls memories of past lives. Now, the general New Age theory is a kind of Mickey Mouse model that the soul is like the semi-transparent figures in the top of movies, and it climbs into one body climbs out of one body into another, and then climbs out of that body into another. For those who like that kind of theory, well, that's the kind of theory they like. I find that a very Mickey Mouse way of thinking of things. I prefer Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, or Rupert Sheldrake's concept of the morphogenetic field, or Leary's concept of the neurogenetic archives. Whatever concept you use, you can get memories from previous periods of history and even previous periods of evolution. And when you get used to that neurogenetic circuit, when you start seeing yourself as a vector in time, of which this present nervous system and this present body is only one part of the vector, it's a genetic vector, and it's more than a genetic vector, and it's moving in time toward a definite moving goal, which seems to be higher intelligence and higher coherence and higher ecstasy. When you see yourself as part of that genetic vector, you begin to see you can have not only memories of the future, but memories of the not only memories of the past, but memories of the future. Science fiction is made up largely of memories of the future. If you analyze the philosophies humanity has invented so far, they fall into four major groups. The cyclical ones, such as you find in the book of Ecclesiastes, everything repeats endlessly. That's the philosophy of Vico and Spengler and Toynbee. The sun goes up and the sun goes down. After winter is summer, and after summer, winter. There's good times and bad times, and the circle keeps turning. And then there's the Stoic philosophies that say you can't understand it, just keep tough and keep hard and keep as high as you can be, and and just expect it's going to be bloody part of the time, bloody awful, but just keep plugging along. And then there's the existentialist philosophies that say you've got to give it value by making decisions that impose your will upon it. And then there's the futurist philosophies. The futurist philosophies say these genetic vectors in time are heading towards something, and we can glide, we can be evolutionary surfers and move on to the higher stages of evolution ahead of anybody else. And then if we have an ounce of compassion in us, we'll try to show them how to do it too. But we don't have to be stuck at this stage of evolution. We can live in the future. And it's been neurogenetic visions of the future which have always inspired humanity to get out of its present rut and move on to a higher stage. The Quakers are very good at this. They have a very simple yoga. They sit in their meeting house and nobody talks until the spirit moves them. The inner light, the Quakers call it. When the inner light moves somebody, he stands up or she stands up and says something like, you know, this church owns property in the slums. I don't think we should take money out of a system like that. Well, somebody gets up and says, you know, I think slavery is a pretty nasty thing. Why don't we start a movement to free the slaves? And this is happening all the time since the invention of Quakerism. These futuristic visions appear and everybody says, oh, those silly Quakers. And then 100 years later, everybody's ready for that stage of evolution. The Quakers have had the vision for a long time we should abolish war. Everybody says, oh, those silly Quakers. Now in the nuclear age, everybody with more than a half-inch of forehead knows we've got to abolish war or war will abolish us. If you want scientific evidence that there is this bank of evolutionary memories and potentials, read Rupert Sheldrake's book, New Science of Life. One of the classic experiments in this field was the one by McDougall, who didn't expect the results he got. He took smart rats and dumb rats and bred them together, the smart rats with the smart rats and the dumb rats with the dumb rats, and he measured their intelligence generation by how fast they could solve a maze. And according to orthodox genetics, mechanistic genetics, the smart rats should have been getting steadily smarter each generation, and the dumb rats should have been getting steadily dumber. It turned out they were all getting smarter at solving the maze, which was the method he was using to measure intelligence. And after 20-some generations, they were all solving the maze faster than the smartest rats in the first generation. McDougall found this so incredible that at great trouble and expense, he repeated the whole experiment with another 27 generations of rats and got the same results. Later, the experiment was repeated in Scotland, and their first generation of rats were doing better than the last generation in McDougall's second set of experiments. It's since been repeated in Australia. Now this information that it can't be carried by genes according to orthodox biology, so it's carried by something else. Sheldrake posits a morphogenetic field to which the genes can be attuned. The morphogenetic field makes sense to me because it fits in with a lot of theories in modern physics which have to do with non-local fields, which may be why David Bohm, the chief proponent of non-local theories in physics for the last 30 years, Bohm wrote his first paper on non-locality in 1952. Bohm was one of the first scientists to take Sheldrake seriously and to propose that Sheldrake's theories be tested rather than just rejected. The majority of biologists wanted to reject his theories. They sounded too spooky. But Bohm kept insisting these theories should be investigated. So far, I've only read of 3 attempts to check Sheldrake, and all 3 of them tended to confirm him. Stanislaus Graf, who's now the chief honcho down at Esalen, up at Esalen, sometimes I don't know which city I'm in. Stanislaus Graf was educated as an orthodox Marxist materialist. When he started doing LSD research in Czechoslovakia, he found people reporting memories of their ancestors which could be confirmed by historical records. You see how this fits into the reincarnation model? Graf called it phylogenetic memory. Jung calls it the collective unconscious. The Theosophists call it the Akashic records. There are all sorts of names for it. But when even a Marxist materialist finds statistical evidence of it, and when it shows up in these rat experiments, I think it's time we took it seriously, especially since it's been happening to me for about 15 or 18 years now. It is possible to see into the past and even into the future. And I assume this is some sort of non-local field. That's what Leary calls the neurogenetic circuit. The 8th circuit is Leary calls the metaphysiological circuit, and then he calls it the neuroatomic circuit. Every book he writes, he changes his name for the 8th circuit. I call it the non-local quantum circuit because it's so adequately described in modern quantum mechanics. All scientific theories up until quantum mechanics, the Einsteinian universe model as well as the Newtonian, can be modeled by billiard balls. You've all seen these billiard balls in high school educational films or on educational television or public television. I hit the billiard ball here, which hits that billiard ball, which hits 3 billiard balls, and that's linear mechanistic causality. The whole holistic rebellion against linear mechanistic causality has been based on doctors and psychologists and others who observe that things do not all happen in that linear mechanistic way. Some things happen by non-local correlations. A Jungian synchronicity. Everybody here has heard of synchronicity, right? Anybody want me to define synchronicity?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Synchronicity is meaningful connection without mechanical connection. Meaningful correlation without mechanical connection. An example, Jung had a patient telling him a dream about a scarab, and Jung thought this is a symbol of rebirth to the Egyptians. He was just developing his theory of the collective unconscious or the morphogenetic field, the neurogenetic circuit. Jung thought this is an Egyptian symbol of rebirth. That means the patient is reaching the rebirth stage in therapy. And at that point, a scarab beetle began banging on the window.
Whoa.
That's where Jung first began to think of synchronicity. Synchronicity happens in all types of psychotherapy. Some pay more attention to it than others, but almost every psychotherapist will admit they've seen it on occasion very dramatically in transformative periods in the therapy. It happens to acid heads all the time, which is why the word has become so popular since the 60s. It happens to everybody doing deep oriental meditation. Quantum mechanics also involves non-local correlations. This was first demonstrated by Einstein and Podolsky and Rosen in 1935. They published it as a reductio ad absurdum of quantum mechanics. They said quantum mechanics implies that if 2 particles were once in contact and they move to the opposite end of the universe, they'll remain correlated even though there's no mechanical connection between them. This implies there's telepathy between them. That's absurd. Therefore, quantum mechanics has something wrong with it. That was 1935. Nobody's found anything wrong with quantum mechanics. It's still the most useful theory in atomic physics. And more things have come out of quantum mechanics, including the atom bomb, which terrifies us all, the television set, which amuses us or bores us, modern computers, designer drugs developed on the basis of quantum mechanics. Everything that's distinctively 20th century technology and not just the development of 19th century technology is based on quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics demands non-local correlations. The latest and most elegant mathematical proof of this was by John S. Bell in 1965, and it's known as Bell's theorem. There have been 7 attempts to check Bell's theorem, and 5 of them have confirmed Bell, and 2 have contradicted Bell. The feeling in the physical community, the community of physicists, is we've got to accept the non-local correlation, because 5 out of 7 is a damn good average. Experimental error is more likely to destroy evidence of correlation than to create false evidence of correlation. And the experiments have gotten increasingly subtle. The latest experiment by Aspe is so subtle that there seems no way of arguing around it. He had 2 switches that cause the measurement to be made in 10 nanoseconds, and the 2 measurements are so far apart that it takes light 20 nanoseconds to travel that distance. Ergo, nothing traveling at the speed of light can travel between one particle and the other to tell the other particle what to do. So there is no mechanical or causal connection. There's no connection in the billiard ball sense. There's no information going from one particle to another. And yet they remain correlated mathematically. Correlation without connection. Non-local correlation.
Like thought?
Well, it's like Jungian synchronicity. Well, it's like thought. There's one physicist, Edwin Harris Walker, who has written a paper called The Complete Quantum Anthropologist, and he says what this non-local correlation implies is that the universe is created out of consciousness. The universe is more like a great thought than like a great machine, as Gene said when he first began to see the implications of quantum math. A non-local correlation means that the universe is a hierarchy of synchronicities, and we only notice some of them. Causality is kind of the facade. Behind the facade, the basic principle is synchronicity, non-local correlation. Now, if things are non-locally correlated, that explains ESP, it explains precognition, it explains out-of-body experiences, it explains most of the data of parapsychology. I've had out-of-body experiences many times, especially dramatically the first time I used the Pulsar brain tuner machine. When you go to 4 hertz, most people have an out-of-body experience eventually if they keep experimenting at 4 hertz, which is the interface between theta and delta in the brain waves. According to the Mickey Mouse model of consciousness, there's a little transparent self inside me which travels in Euclidean space somewhere else during an out-of-body experience. According to the non-local model, there is no spooky little essence like that inside me. Consciousness is an aspect of the non-local field, which we call the universe. My brain just tunes in. Consciousness is not in my brain any more than Johnny Carson is in my TV. My TV tunes in Johnny Carson. Well, not very often. My TV tunes in Columbo quite often, every chance I can. But Columbo is not in my TV. My TV is just a local receiver. Columbo is a non-local signal. Anybody else in the country can turn in Columbo if they want. People 10 light years from here can tune in old Columbo shows. So Columbo is a non-local signal, and the consciousness is a non-local phenomenon which each brain tunes in locally. When you learn how to use your brain for fun and profit and explore all the circuits, you find out that non-local perception is very easy indeed. Even though the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal will call you a fraud if you talk about any of your non-local perceptions. People have been discovering this since the dawn of history. As far back as we can find records, we find references to ESP, precognition, out-of-body experiences, synchronicity, all this controversial stuff. It's been happening to human beings forever because consciousness, I think, is a non-local phenomenon. And the 8th circuit, you learn more and more to function on the non-local circuitry of the brain and tune in more and more distant information. until eventually you begin to see a cosmic pattern, and at that point you become some kind of mystic and start raving and gibbering, and I try not to do that. Let's just say that the higher you go, the prettier it gets out there. Okay, I seem to have about 10 minutes left. I think I will have a question and answer period. No, or should we get out so the next group can come in?
No.
Oh, we got 10 minutes, okay.
What's the seventh circuit?
Huh?
And then just identify the seventh circuit.
Neurogenetic circuit. That's the circuit in which you're suddenly an ape creature wandering through the African jungle, or you're suddenly an insect.
That was the seventh?
Yeah, the neurogenetic.
Several times. Which brain machine do you use?
I've used quite a few of them. What's my favorite? They're all interesting. My favorites, plural, are the NeuroPep because it's fairly cheap and does the same as a lot of the other light and sound machines that are more expensive. The Grain Potentializer because it seems to do things none of the others do. And the Mind Mirror because I think I have a very visual style of consciousness. I find the Mind Mirror fascinating because it shows how much alpha, how much beta, alpha, theta, and delta you have in each hemisphere. I find it fascinating to sit looking at the Mind Mirror doing various exercises and watching my brain patterns change. To me, that's much more entertaining than TV. It's almost as much fun as my computer.
What about Lily's work with the flotation tanks? Have you experimented with that?
Yeah, I've experimented with flotation tanks, and they've done a lot of good for a lot of people. And there's some scientific evidence that they do increase endorphin production and other neuropeptides, and they probably boost the immune system as well as giving you a fascinating psychedelic trip. I don't like the isolation tanks. I prefer other techniques. There's something in me I haven't conquered yet. I don't like being alone in the dark and wondering what's going on in the rest of the establishment. And if it's on fire, will they remember to come haul me out of this place? And, that kind of thing.
Do you have a problem with that with psychedelic? If you were to take acid and be in a tank?
Yeah, everybody has their own favorite techniques. The isolation tank is not one of my favorite techniques. I'll try it again and see if I can get over that mild phobia I have about it. Yes.
I just have two things. I wanted to know, did you ever find the guy that gave the pit bull the AIDS? I want to know what he looks like. The other thing's a riddle. I just want to know, what's the way you figure out that George Bush has actually in reality been elected president?
Well, about the pit bull with AIDS, since most people haven't heard that joke, what's worse than meeting a pit bull with AIDS? Meeting the guy who gave it to the pit bull. And how did George Bush get elected? 22% of the population voted for him.
No, not how, but how do we know this is so now?
Oh, how do we know that it's so? How do we know the newspapers aren't deceiving us? We don't.
Well, I found evidence of it.
What?
His wife's picture is on the dollar bill.
You know, I've often wondered about the death of Liberace. There's been a lot of controversy about that. But if you close your eyes during a George Bush speech and listen closely, it's possible that Liberace faked his death, had a plastic surgery job, and went into politics. You listen to those intonations and rhythms, and you'll see.
Or is Chuck Berry really doing time?
Could you comment about the theory of chaos and how it
Theory of chaos, yeah.
how it ties in or doesn't tie in?
Yeah, well, chaos, the most interesting part of chaos theory is the fractals. The universe has fractals in it. Now, there's one of the places where I don't think God made a mistake. I think fractals are really groovy. Fractals are mathematical systems in which there are definite laws controlling them, but they are always surprised by the way they develop. I've got a fractal generator on my computer, and sometimes I got nothing else to do. I sit there and just stare. I just keep changing the parameters, and I get these beautiful new patterns each time. Nature is full of fractals, and when you see computer-generated fractals, it gradually dawns on you, this is getting us closer to nature than any other scientific theory ever has. Visually, you can see it. It looks more like nature. A Newtonian force diagram doesn't look like nature at all. It's a very abstract model. The fractals look like the way things really grow and develop in time, the way organisms grow and sea coasts and clouds. weather systems. Fractals, chaos theory came out of meteorology originally. It was the meteorologist who invented it. I have a game I sometimes do as a seminar. It's called Cosmic Conspiracy, the game of enlightenment, where everybody is deceiving everybody else. And it's dawned on me, I've created a game with fractals because I never know what's going to happen. I start the game, and after half an hour, I don't know what's going on. I'm as confused as all the players. And I figured that's why God put fractals in the universe. If I can be whimsical for a moment and assume there is a God, if there were no fractals in the universe, God would know everything before it happens, and the whole thing would be boring to watch. By putting fractals in, God guaranteed continuous amusement. There's always an element of surprise. Everything that happens is a slight surprise. I think enlightenment, in a sense, is becoming more and more aware of fractals, whether you know the word fractals or not. Seeing the perpetual upsurge of novelty, as Henri Bergson said. Okay, I guess we got time for, yes.
What exactly is the story with the number 23?
Next question. that was too much to grapple with at this late stage. And yes.
Where can you find the fractal programs that you said that you have at your computer?
That's an interesting question. Where do you find it? Yeah.
You can find it printed in some books, actually. Check the library under the computer section. Or recent magazines will actually have printouts.
Yeah, a lot of my software was given to me by fans and friends. I don't know where the hell it came from. They just give me a disc and say, try this. Wait till you see what you can do now. I mean, that's the way a great deal of the computer revolution is proceeding, is by affinity groups, people exchanging software. It looks to me like the collapse of monopoly capitalism, because more and more people are giving away more and more things. And information is the essence of wealth, which I proved this morning and don't have time to prove again now. You have to take my word for it. Wealth is based on information. Oh, I'll give you a brief argument to that effect. You don't get rich if you're digging for oil where there's no oil. If you have correct information and drill for oil where there is oil, you'll get rich. That's the connection between information and wealth. And it is now 5 o'clock, and I'm off duty. I'm going to relax and go home and take my shoes off.